My name is Tina Lining, and I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Excellence here in the School of Medicine. And we are excited to begin our Asian American Pacific Islander program. This is our inaugural program, and on behalf of Dean Gerson and the School of Medicine, I welcome you to our first AAPI program. And our committee, if our committee is here, won't you please stand? Some of you, we want to just thank you. Thank you all for your commitment to this work. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And please note, everyone, the month of May has several themes, cultural themes. It is Mental Health Awareness Month, Asian American Pacific Islander Month. It is Jewish Awareness, and I think Cinco de Mayo. So there are several themes in the month of May, and that is and mental health awareness. And so that is the only reason why we sort of showcased AAPI and mental health awareness for those purposes only. Okay, so we just want to clarify that for everyone so that it didn't send mixed messages. So again, Asian American Heritage Month is a celebration of Asians and Pacific Islanders. The month of May was chosen to commemorate the immigration of the first Japanese to the United States on May the 7th, 1843, and to mark the anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May the 10th, 1869. According to the United States government census, as of 2020, there were around 25 million people of Asian or Pacific Islander descent in the United States. They make up 7% of the total U.S. population, around 3% of military veterans, and have Asian heritage. And there are an estimate of 590,000 employer firms owned by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. So with that being said, it is indeed my honor and privilege to celebrate the Asian American Pacific Islander population here in the School of Medicine. And with that, we have an outstanding speaker in the person of Naomi Sigg, the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at John Carroll University. In her role, she oversees the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion, Student Accessibility Services, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the Title IX initiatives, and faculty and staff training, development, and programming. She also teaches Asian American history for the honors program. Naomi has more than 15 years of progressive experience in higher education, with a specialization in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, leadership, and student development. Most recently, she served as Senior Associate Dean of Students, Director of Multicultural Affairs at Case Western Reserve University. Yay! Now, Naomi has been invited to share her experience and expertise in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging throughout the field, doing presentations for various conferences, including the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, the International Conference on Conflict Resolution and Education, and the Association College Personnel Association. In addition to her work at higher education or in higher education institutions, Naomi also served as the Executive Director for Midwest Asian American Students Union. She is currently on the Equity Committee for the District of Twinsburg Schools, is a board member for a new nonprofit to support veterans and their families, and serves as a mentor for College Now. Naomi received both her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. She is a proud first-generation Filipina immigrant who lives in Northeast Ohio with her partner and 3 beautiful children. Please welcome Naomi.
Thank you so much, Tina.
You are welcome.
I am so glad to be here with you all today, and I have a presentation. It's pretty packed, so I want to go ahead and get started because I have a lot of good stuff that I'm hoping will help you feel a little bit more knowledgeable about the AAPI community, the barriers they face, and ways that we can all be advocates and allies for the community, whether you're in the community or whether you're wanting to just be an ally. So I start with this photo because it's really important that we recognize that in the past few years we've seen not a surge, because this has been happening over many, many centuries, but an awareness of Asian harassment, violence, and hate that's been going on, particularly during and post-COVID. I love this photo because it is a reminder, it is a call to action, that we need to become more educated. We need to be able to stand in solidarity with all of our underrepresented and disenfranchised communities, including the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. So I start with that photo because it's a reminder and it's a call to action. So let me give you a couple quick facts, because I think it's so important that we start with some things that are going on. So if you haven't already familiarized yourself with an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, they have wonderful reports online, and they do a lot of work to gather data so that we have a better understanding of what's going on in the United States and in the community. So here's just a quick fact about what's been going on. So from March 19th, 2020 to December 31st, 2021, almost 11,000 hate incidents against the AAPI community were reported. And the majority were harassment, and then after that, physical assault. So you often see physical assault be kind of lower on that trend, but for this community, it was actually the second most. And we probably saw lots of news stories, and many of you may have seen lots of news stories of people being attacked, particularly elderly AAPI folks, being attacked on subways, walking down the street, being shoved. We saw a woman who was pushed into onto a train, a platform in a subway. We saw another Asian American woman who was beaten right in front of an apartment building where security officers watched. So we know that this is an issue, and this is, it's a dramatic change. It was about a 1,900% increase in violence and harassment toward the AAPI community. I just recently saw this, and I thought it was interesting because it just shows the lack of knowledge, the lack of presence and education that we get. So there was a survey that went out to people that said, can you name a famous Asian American person? And so pretty much 1 in 4 said, I don't know. And then the highest number of folks that were listed, the first person was Jackie Chan, who does not necessarily identify as Asian American. The second was Bruce Lee, who has been dead for about 50 years. And the third was our Vice President Kamala Harris. Everyone else who answered either answered incorrectly or just said, I didn't know. And so that is something for us to be considering. We don't have a good awareness or knowledge base of the AAPI community, even here in the United States. Just a year and a day ago, did we have the very first state to not only require, but also fund, and I think that's what's the important part. It's to require and to fund Asian American and Pacific Islander history in public schools. 2022. So we've been living here since, I know you said the 1800s. Actually, the real history is that Filipinos have been here since the 1600s, but we won't talk about, that's more history that we don't learn. But let me tell you, that's the first state and the first time that we're requiring it, and we're putting it into K-12. There was a bill here in Ohio, SB 214, a couple years ago that was trying to get Asian American Pacific Islander history in our Ohio schools. So keep a lookout for that. We're hoping that'll come back. And then let's talk about healthcare. So I was recently able to go to the Cleveland International Film Festival, and there was a world premiere of a film called Nurse Unseen. Has anybody heard of that? Anybody heard of it? Okay. So this was a documentary about Filipino nurses. And one of the striking, statistics that they talked a lot about was that even though Filipino nurses make about 4% of the nursing population, they made up 30% of the COVID-19 deaths. And as I listened to the stories in the documentary, what stood out to me, as we even talked about mental health, is that they're still recovering from all that grief, from all that loss, when it comes to their fellow nursing team members, healthcare workers who'd passed. And so that's just something for us to be thinking about. And then the Association of American Colleges, Medical Colleges, did a survey in 2019. And the reason why I wanted this data was because I wanted to show that this isn't something that's new. This has been happening a long time. And they surveyed about 6,000 physicians, and they said that 1 in 3 reported being subject to racially or ethnically offensive names or remarks in the past 12 months. And that's, 1 in 3 are getting this harassment, and that's before the pandemic. So we know that this is, more of an awareness. This is something that's been happening, and you're not immune in the healthcare field to this harassment as well. So this is where we are, and my hope is that we're gonna take some time to go through 3 different sections, but I like to talk about where we currently are. So 1, there's a little bit more awareness of anti-Asian hate, violence, and harassment. A little bit more, right? AAPI communities still feel isolated, they still feel unheard, and they still feel invisible. And I'm so thankful that you all are having this event today, and I hope that this is something you'll do every year, that you'll bring speakers, and not just in the month of May, but throughout the year, because we also know that a lot of people are gone. It's May, commencement has occurred, and so we don't necessarily maybe have the attention of many folks. So I hope that there are ways we can incorporate this throughout the year. We also are seeing that there are more protests, more activism on the rise, especially in our youth, who are doing things like letter writing campaigns. They're not just supporting their own identities, but standing in solidarity with the Black community. So that's something that we're seeing a little bit more of. There's still a lack of understanding of the AAPI experience. People don't understand what people have gone through. There's no education. The education is very, very small. Oftentimes I'm asked to come and do the sort of section in ethnic studies in a course. Oh, can you do the AAPI piece because our book only has like 2 or 3 pages. So that's really, unfortunate. And then there's little to no background on the history or contributions of AAPI folks. When I teach Asian American Studies, I ask my students to write down on pieces of Post-it paper every moment in history that was sort of something they learned in their high school years. All the big things, right? Vietnam War, Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton, all those things. And I have them put it on the Post-it note, and then when they're done, I tell them, okay, I want you to star anything that has anything to do with the AAPI community, anything. And then I want you to circle anything that has anything to do with the AAPI community in a positive way. So contributions, things that people that are important to our history. And let me just tell you that the stars and the circles, if at all visible, are pretty small. And then finally, there's a need for more resources and training to best support this community, and that's why I'm here today, is hopefully I can share with you a few things. So here's where we're headed. I always like to start with understanding the population, the history, the context, because it's important. I bet many of you have not. So raise your hand if you got a lot of AAPI history in your K-12 experience. If you're on Zoom, there are no hands up, just so you know. The second part of this presentation is we're going to talk about barriers that the AAPI community faces, because that's something that we don't talk a lot about, what employers and students face on a daily basis. And then 3, what are the strategies, the resources, and the best practices for the future? How can we be better advocates and allies to this community? All right, so let's start here. Who are we? What's the AAPI community made of? I know Tina said a little bit. So according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the AAPI community makes up 20.6 million people in the U.S. from 26 different groups. It's a lot of people. A lot of different communities, ethnicities, and cultures, and languages, and customs are in here. It's a very complex population. There are a lot of different people who have different identities. Some of them are multi-ethnic identities as well. Lots of different foods and religions and traditions. And the sad part is we have very little data. We do not do enough data and research around this population. I was sitting in a presentation maybe about a year and a half ago around mental health needs of the AAPI community, and there was a physician there who was talking about pre-1990, there were a handful of research studies really regarding the AAPI community around mental health. And that to me was very striking to me, that we didn't have enough knowledge to even know how to support this community around mental health issues. It's a population that's rising. According to Pew, it's the fastest growing population in the United States. Behind it is the Latina community. And so if you look at this, the population has increased about 81% between 2000 and 2019, and it's estimated to be about 35 million by 2060. So this is a population that we have to not only support, but be prepared for in higher education. How will we be supporting our students, our faculty, our staff who are coming into our institutions? How will we ensure that they are successful? How will we eliminate barriers that they face? So let's go through some history. I always love doing this. This is what I do with my students. We're going to go through a quick history of people and situations that have happened in the United States that you probably didn't know a lot about or didn't hear a lot about. So starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882, this is kind of like one of those caricature cartoons that you'll see a lot of times, the way in which they portrayed the Chinese immigrants and laborers who came to the United States, who many of them came here to really help with the transcontinental railroads. So this quote was from Senator Aaron A. Sargent, who said, "The Chinese are swarming millions of men, alien not alone to our blood and to our language, but to our faith. There can be no remedy except general exclusion." And what was happening was that the Chinese were coming in and they were doing things that were just different than what the United States and, sort of American culture had. Men were coming in and they were cooking, they were sewing, and people didn't like that. That was too different. They don't do that. My father was always the person, I'm not very tall, to always sew my pants so that I could have, a good hem on them. And that was not seen as a very positive thing to have that attribute. And so they also didn't want people to be intermarrying and having children together. And so exclusion was sort of this thought of, we've got to just stop having them come here. And I'll tell you what, this is not something that's has gone away. We've already seen things like in SB 83 here in Ohio that is trying to also exclude Chinese international students and from being in-state institutions in Ohio, and really trying to ramp up more stricter guidelines around creating relationships with China. So it's not as if this is something that's gone away too. So I just want to kind of put that in there. This photo. Does anybody know what this photo is? Anyone? I know it's really hard to see, but this is a photo of the completion. Yes, thank you. This is the completion photo of the Transcontinental Railroad that went to Promontory, Utah. What do we see that's interesting in this photo? Anything interesting? Absolutely. So this photo was kind of created, but they took all of the Chinese laborers out. And the Chinese laborers, there were about 15,000 who were part of building the Transcontinental Railroad. They were paid less than the white workers. They were not allowed to sleep inside of the cars. And they just had worse working conditions. They were often given the roles that were more dangerous, so explosives were given to them. And so there were a lot of injuries and deaths that occurred. And they didn't even get a chance to be part of this photo. And some of you may ask, with those horrible conditions, why didn't they strike? Well, they did. And being out in rural and remote areas, there was no one to get them food and access to supplies, so that ended pretty quickly for them. I like this photo better, 145 years later. This is a photo by Corky Lee on the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, a remake with all of the descendants of the workers and the laborers to be included, to be represented, to not be invisible, as I said earlier in my presentation. And this is the type of stuff that we need to teach. We need to know, because otherwise it gets lost and people don't realize what contributions the AAPI community has made in the United States. Another moment in history that people don't know too much about is, of course, the Japanese internment, where over 120,000 Japanese were interned in several different locations in remote areas of the United States. 10% of those folks died. We had several folks who had issues with getting access to education and nutrition. There was a quote, there was a saying, where folks were told who were in the internment camps, oh, we're keeping you in here to keep you safe. And the answer to that was, then why are the guns pointing inward? Such an interesting, I think what's harder for me is when I think about this, when people were able to go home, they often went home to not their home anymore. They went home to people taking their homes, to taking their things, that their neighbors who they maybe had barbecues with and play dates with their kids were the ones who went into their homes and took their items, their belongings. How do you reintroduce yourself to society after that, after being seen as an enemy of the state, basically? So there's a book called When the Emperor Was Divine. It was a common reading book several years ago at another institution I worked at, which is a great way to create historical empathy, is to have sort of that historical fiction. So if you're interested, that's a great resource. Has anybody heard of Dalip Singh Sound? Anyone? He's a very important figure in the United States history. He is the first Asian American and the first Indian American and the first Indian immigrant and the first Sikh American to be elected to Congress. Lots of firsts. Definitely a trailblazer, but we don't hear his name. He was the reason why Indian Americans were able to be naturalized, and he was able to also be naturalized after it passed in Congress, and it was approved in 1946. He faced a lot of racism and issues when he was running for his seat. One time in a restaurant, people came up to him and said, "So if you were to become, in this position, is everybody going to have to wear a turban?" And he said, "It doesn't matter to me what people have on their head. It matters to me what's inside their head." Grace, So this is something that I think we don't know a lot about this man. And we don't hear his name, but I wanted to speak it today because he's an important part of history. And then we see another moment in history that really changed the course of immigration here in the United States. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 really changed the way in which Asian immigration shifted. So it opened up the doors, basically. And so the Asian countries were able to quadruple the immigration in the 5 years following the act. My family is a beneficiary of this act. My mom and her 9 brothers and sisters and mom came here in the early 70s. Previous policies barred immigration from Asian countries, as you saw, the Chinese Exclusion Act, but there were also bans on Filipinos coming to the United States as well. And then in the 50s, if you look at this number, it's really striking. More than half of all immigrants were from Europe. They were Europeans, and just 6% were from Asian countries. And in the 90s, it's flopped. It's only 16% of immigrants are European, and now 31% were of Asian descent. So we saw a huge change, and that's what shifted a lot of higher education as we started to see centers for multicultural affairs to really kind of create more spaces for different folks who are coming into the United States. Anybody heard of this man, Vincent Chin? So just a few names, few people. So Vincent, just like anyone else, on his sort of bachelor party, went to a bar with his friends to drink, hang out, celebrate, and he got into an altercation with 2 men. And those 2 men happened to work in the auto industry. This is, just to give you some context, this is Detroit, 1982. And these 2 men decided that Vincent was Japanese and that he and everybody that's Japanese is the reason why the auto industry in the United States was having some problems. And so they got into a fight. The 2 men followed Vincent after he left the bar, and they caught up with him, took out a bat, and beat Vincent until they cracked his skull, and he died a few days later. These 2 men, who were stepfather and stepson, were not put in jail for this murder. They actually just paid a small fine, and the judge even said things like, "These 2 men aren't the type of men you put in jail." If you watch, there are some great documentaries. Vincent Hu is one of them. And this sort of sparked this Asian American civil rights movement. This idea that if this doesn't happen to Vincent, it's going to happen to any of our community. And so there was sort of this idea of we've got to band together. And so there was a spark and a new sort of movement for Asian American civil rights due to the death of Vincent. And it's hard for me to look at this photo because I have photos of my dad in the 70s, and he looks like that. He does. Anybody know Patsy Mink? Patsy Mink is so important. Yes, of course you know Patsy Mink. She was the first Japanese American woman to practice law in Hawaii, the first Asian American woman to serve in Congress, and one of the authors and sponsors of Title IX. Title IX, which impacts all of us in higher education. Thank you. Yes, Title IX, which provides, equitable education for anyone. It says no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So we have Patsy Mink to thank when it comes to ensuring that we don't have discrimination on the basis of sex in higher education and in education in general. And her name is not something that people know. And it's really sad, because we can say Title IX, but we don't know the people behind it. So I wanted to share that history because I think it's so important that we have a little bit of history as we move forward, so you know a little bit more about the contributions and the importance and the moments that the AAPI community have contributed to and or have suffered from here in the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about the barriers to success when it comes to the AAPI community. There's a continued lack of understanding when it comes to the diverse needs, so disaggregating data is important. We have this sort of myth called the model minority myth that's very, very dangerous for many AAPI folks and can really cause a lot of problems. We have microaggressions that occur on a daily basis. There's something called the bamboo ceiling that I'll talk a little bit about that also prohibits AAPI folks from excelling and advancing in their work. And then just continued lack of culturally specific resources, like Asian American studies, something that I kind of talked about a little bit earlier. So this photo here is from Time Magazine. Has anybody seen that or remember that? So this idea that, oh, the Asian Americans are whiz kids, right? And that's that model minority myth that's coming into play. And this was really started, this concept was started in the 60s when a man wrote an article that talked about how the Japanese, after the internment camps, were able to kind of pick themselves up with, from their bootstraps and be successful. What else was happening in the 1960s? Civil rights. So it was a way to create, create this sort of like pit against different minoritized communities. So if you think about it, very interesting that it was created by design. So this model minority myth, it says that all Asians are successful, they do well in school, they're rich, they're doing great, they have no problems, right? And this creates a lot of unrealistic expectations to perform well. It doesn't take into account the diversity of the group. It erases individuality. It erases the racism that has happened to the AAPI community in the US. It maintains this perpetual foreigner, that you don't belong. This can never be your home, even if your family has lived here more generations than that person's family. And it also is harmful to the racial justice struggle, and it pits marginalized communities against each other. So this unrealistic expectations piece is real. I've heard it from many of the students that I've worked with, that they have a hard time asking for help, that they want to overlook their struggles, everything's fine. And this has a lot of mental health implications. It creates internalized oppression. It can really kind of flare up this imposter syndrome that a lot of people, many of you probably have heard about. And then it also creates these feelings of guilt and shame when you don't reach what you think you're supposed to reach in society. For lack of time, I'm going to skip this video, but I'll send it to Tina. But the Steve Fund is an organization that really looks into the mental health of youth, and particularly youth of color. And this video shows how the model minority myth has impacted particularly a student in higher education. So again, model minority myth, it takes away the diversity of populations. It doesn't take into account that many different communities have different types of experiences, and it erases that individuality. The Urban Institute put out this sort of data around the net worth or wealth of Asian Americans in Los Angeles. So when you look at the Korean wealth, there's a huge gap between Korean and Japanese wealth. And that shows that this idea that everybody's doing fine is not accurate. There are other studies out there that show that we have a lot of folks in high schools that have a hard time even graduating high school, particularly our Cambodian, Laotian, and Hmong communities, Vietnamese communities graduate at a lower rate in high schools. And so to say that everybody's doing great in this model minority myth as it continues can really take away the resources needed to really ensure that students are taken care of. So just a quick story about that. When the Vietnam War ended and there were a lot of Vietnamese refugees, a lot more folks were coming in the United States. They didn't have the skills around English. They didn't have a lot of the sort of backgrounds that we required when we opened up the gates in 1965 with the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which really let in people who had degrees and had something they could offer. And then as we got refugees coming in, there was a disparity, and the resources were not given to really make sure those folks were given the best possible outcome in their educational journey. And this is just, it continues to erase history. I won't go through all of these, but did you know that in 1871, 19 Chinese men and boys were shot and hanged, and it was the largest lynching in the United States? Public lynching. Did you know that Balbir Singh Sodhi was the first man, Sikh man, who was killed after 9/11 because they felt that he must be Arab, he must be part of what just happened in 9/11. These things we don't know, we don't talk about them, we erase the racism in the history. And then the perpetual foreigner stereotype. I don't know about you, I'm Filipino American, I came here as an immigrant when I was young, but I still get the who are you, I still get the where are you from, I still get the, no, where are you really from, or where are your parents from, I get that all the time. It doesn't matter how long you've lived here in the United States, many AAPI folks get that. Even if you've probably lived here or your family's lived here longer than the person asking you, you still get that. And finally, the model minority myth is harmful to this racial justice struggle. We need to create solidarity. We need to confront anti-Asian hate, anti-blackness, and lots of different racial struggles that we know occur here in the United States. We've got to band together. So how can we combat the myth? How can we change things? We've got to disaggregate data. So as you're all doing research or thinking about things, how can you disaggregate data? How can you check your own biases and stereotypes? So when you meet someone who might be from the AAPI community, how do you kind of quiet your mind when you have that perpetual foreigner thought in your mind for some reason? Because I know that many doctors and healthcare workers are often asked where they're from when their patients meet with them. I've heard that from many of my friends. Even as a patient, it's the first thing that people will ask me is, where were you born? And I don't know that everybody gets that question. And there are valid reasons for it, but it's disarming at first, And then finally, create space for unique voices and stories. How do you create more sessions like this? How do you listen to the stories of the AAPI community? How do you uplift that in your work, in your role, in your community? Because quite frankly, just like many other folks that are in marginalized identities experience microaggressions, the AAPI community is experiencing them too. Dr. Daryl Dwing Sue, who's done a lot of research on microaggressions, talks about these things as those daily slights and snubs and the small interactions you have that kind of communicate based on that identity that's marginalized, that you don't belong, that you're different and different is bad, that something's wrong with you, and that happens all the time to different folks. It can be things like, can I give you a nickname because your name's too hard to say? Or where are you really from? What are you? You're not like the other fill in the blank people I know. Or I don't even think of you as fill in the blank. These things you might think are nice are actually harmful and can often erase people's identities. And then we think about other barriers, which include the bamboo ceiling. It's kind of like the glass ceiling, but it's the ceiling that a lot of AAPI folks face when it comes to being able to be successful. So there's exclusion from leadership positions because they're not seen as leadership material for whatever reason, because maybe they have a different communication style, or perhaps even they're succumbed to the sticky floor syndrome, which is this idea that people who do really good work, kind of crunching the numbers or doing kind of the menial tasks or the hard labor, they got to stay on the floor because they do that really well, and we don't want them to leave that because then we'll have to find someone else. So they're often stuck to the ground floor of any type of organization. And then we have, of course, equitable resources being an issue. So as we think about celebrating many different cultural heritage months or events, making sure that we're also providing resources for the AAPI community. If you have cultural celebrations for graduations, do you have it for the AAPI community? So thinking about that. And of course, intersectionality is an issue. So folks are not just one thing. We have AAPI folks who are also part of the LGBT community, who are part of different religious identities, who are folks with disabilities. And so there is an intersectionality to this. And then a study in 2011 from the Center for Talent looks at, who's at the top. 1.4% of Fortune 500 CEOs and 1.9% of corporate officers overall. That's very low. And then when you look at our government in the United States, it's about the same. So this is something that we see and we see as an issue. So what do? We can educate ourselves, we can support folks in the community, we can amplify voices, and we can advocate when we see something that's going on that shouldn't be going on. So these are some things that you can do to just start building your awareness, okay? So what do you know about the recent rise in awareness around anti-Asian hate, violence, and harassment? Can you be an ally? Have you ever thought about if you ever saw somebody doing something, what would you do? How would you address it? There's a group called I Holla Back. They actually do a lot of different upstander trainings that you can attend for free. And there are several other organizations who do the same thing. What do you know about AAPI history and the contributions that folks have made to the United States? What might be some of the contemporary or pressing issues of this community, including international communities? We've got to take care of our international community. Case Western has a large international community. Do we ever talk about ways to best support them? What issues are prevalent in your surrounding community? Just here in Cleveland, we just had Cleveland Asian Festival. I hope some folks were able to go to that. That's a great way to support the community and to meet different organizations who are doing good work. And then finally, what resources are you more aware of to gain more knowledge? Can you be working with Tina and asking her what resources are available? So there are other offices on this campus who can do the same. And then what are some culturally specific resources? I don't know that Case Western has an Asian American Studies, but perhaps there might be need for classes or courses. What organizations do we know of here in the community? Are there opportunities for mentoring? How do we train folks on how to work with and support the AAPI community better? Do we have equity in programs and initiatives? You can do that. You can kind of do your own assessment of, are we doing this work? How many times have you seen a speaker that looks like me in front of you? Wellness, mental health, and health needs. How are we thinking about the wellness, the mental health, and the health needs of the AAPI community specifically? Are we talking about that? When I worked here, for several years, it was almost about 9 years here, I had a lot of students in the community who had that same issue with the model minority myth, the struggles, but not being able to say anything, and the worry that you were going to not meet expectations, and no one to really talk to because the representation and leadership on this campus around having AAPI folks here, very small. Who's at the top? So a couple things. You all are doing it. If you want to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month, make sure they represent a broad spectrum of ethnicities. Make sure history is included. Make sure intersectionality is included. Don't just do the food and performance, which a lot of places like to do. Involve your community partners. Maybe you should have a committee to help make sure that a lot of voices can create something great. And make sure that the events are for all faculty, staff, students, community members, alumni, everyone. And then just a couple other resources. We've got some community, there are community resources here in Cleveland, Asia Services in Action. We have the OCA, which is the Organization for Chinese Americans in Greater Cleveland. We've got a lot of different folks that are very helpful. I'm part of the Filipino American Historical Society, National Historical Society. Make sure you're hiring people to reflect these populations. Are you thinking about that as you recruit? Look at institutional data for areas of support. So back it up with data. Have you disaggregated? Have you asked institutional, if you have institutional research, look at this specific community. You can check out Stop AAPI Hate, the ally events I shared, I Holla Back, and just keep learning. There are great books out there. Our book club, our faculty book club is reading Minor Feelings right now by Kathy Park Hong. And so there are ways that you can be doing those things as well. Support your colleagues. I know that we in higher education, we like to talk about students a lot, and we should, but we've got to also support our colleagues, the people who we work with every day. Here is a really great pledge that I really enjoyed reading when I saw this, and I wonder if we can all commit to this. And it says, I pledge my commitment as an active ally to the AAPI community. I will educate myself about the struggles and triumphs of the AAPI individuals. I will celebrate AAPI voices in my community and workplace. I will do my part to stop white supremacy by speaking out against anti-Blackness and anti-Asian hate. I wonder if we can all do that and what it would look like if we did. So I appreciate your time, and I will turn it back over to Tina for questions.
Outstanding, outstanding. Let's give her one more round of applause. Wow, wow. Thank you so much, Naomi, for heightening our awareness and just lifting so many layers, multiple layers, right, around the AAPI population. Before we move forward, are there any questions for Naomi? Any questions in the audience? Any? And use the microphone. Questions or feedback? Okay. Thank you.
Is it working? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes. So I was there at the training, at the office of OADO, at the champions training, and one of my colleagues in the training, he asked this question. He has a son who graduated from CASE, and he is an Indian, an Asian, and he built his own startup. And then while doing the bidding for the funding, he couldn't do it himself. His supervisor asked him not to do it by himself and asked the CFO, who is a white American, to do the bidding in place of him, because otherwise, if he do the bidding, the Indian person do the bidding, he would lose the funding. So he's been constantly struggling with that. He's been constantly doing dinner chats with his son, like trying to find a solution to how to deal with that. And all people in that room, like we were 25 people in that room, and we were not able to come up with a solution, like how do we deal with such situations?
Yeah, that's a really good, a sad scenario, but the reality, and the questions I have in my mind as you kind of shared that with us is, you know, what would have been the outcome should he have done the bidding? And why did the CFO feel as though that was the only possible outcome? And perhaps that person had insider knowledge that the person they were going to talk to might have bias against people, and perhaps their intention was to protect them. But the fact of the reality is that's a horrible thing, that they should not have to face that. But the reality is there is bias, and that people have a hard time. I've done so many different presentations. I remember doing presentations to credit loan officers to say, what biases do you have when you're giving out loans, and how does that impact different types of communities? And it does, and it's same thing in this situation. And it could be around a lot of things. It could be bias around folks who, folks from different cultural identities. It can be bias around, you know, for names and where people are originally from, and there's just so many reasons why. It can be accents, it could be so many things. My parents oftentimes have me, you know, I'm a cultural broker because my parents want me to do the ordering the pizza and the talking to the doctor, because they don't feel as though people take them seriously. They feel as though people, because of their accent, make fun of them or won't tell them the whole truth. And so all of that can be layered into this situation. I'm not saying there's an answer for it. I think there should be an awareness of why that's going on. And quite frankly, that CFO could be an ally. So my question to that person would be, how could you allow for that person to still have autonomy? Maybe you go with them, but you push back if you hear anything that's negative. And that's why we need, you know, sessions like this, because we need allies. We need people who don't look like us, who have positions of power and influence, who are believed, to be able to stand up and say, you know what, I'm here coming with so-and-so because I'm so excited about this. I'm going to have him do the pitch, and then if you have questions, let me tell you, you know, I'm happy to answer too, but let me tell you why you should support him. You know, why couldn't that be one of the options? Just a thought. Does that help?
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed the whole presentation, but I really enjoyed the history and learning. Once again, you were saying like what a lot of us, I don't think any of us raised our hand for some of the individuals that you spoke about, and it's really unfortunate and sad. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the recent Ohio legislative decision to no longer not enforce any kind of mandatory diversity trainings in higher education. I know as a staff at this university, I really enjoyed participating in Diversity 360 and also getting to lead it for incoming students. And I felt like it creates that space that you said, like for voices, for people to actually be vulnerable with each other. And I'm worried if that's no longer mandatory, how do we still, are there ways that we can still encourage people to make it not mandatory, but still please come, you know, things like that. I'm a little worried about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I'm going to say this probably because I just went to the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Ed about a month ago. Everybody that does a role like me, we're going to keep doing our job, no matter what. However we have to do it, if we got to change things a little bit, we got to change the language, whatever, we're going to still do our jobs because we still have people we need to support. We still have education that we've got to provide for all of our faculty, our staff, and our students, and we're going to find a way because we've been doing this. We've faced roadblocks and barriers before. This is just a different one, and we will continue. So I can say that because I know that sentiment was very much the same for many of my counterparts at different institutions. Here in Ohio, SB 83, I know that private institutions have been pulled out of the language of the recent amendments. I don't know if you all know that. But I think, you know, I think it is important that we continue to create a culture where people just want to do this. You know, how do you create a culture where it's not about making anything mandatory? Diversity 360, I helped create that. It's not mandatory. It's just something that we tell students they're supposed to go to, faculty and staff. We hope they go to it. It's highly recommended, but you don't get a fine if you don't do it. You're right. So, but how do we create that culture that Case Western Reserve, we're just a place that has such a diversity of people and experiences that we want to be prepared to interact with folks who are like us and different than us so that we can go out into our professions, into our communities, and serve people at the highest level. That's what we want to do. That's who we want to be. How can we create that culture? And I think we just have to do those types of things. We have to message that, and it should come from our leadership, and it should come from the people who are just coming in, our students. So top down, bottom up, we've got to create that culture.
Any other questions for Naomi? Again, thank you, Naomi. And that question is very sensitive, and you answered it in alignment with Case Western Reserve University as well, because we are following the lead, right? President Kaler and the School of Medicine, we value diversity, and our vision and mission is the same, to drive the work, right? And create safe spaces like this to unpack, to educate, and to drive in the institution where we are ensuring that all know that we value this work. So again, thank you so much for your contribution and adding value to the academic space here. We thank you all for being here, and thank you all that are online, zooming in this afternoon. And for you all that are here, please feel free to stay. We have a small festival out in the lobby here for you to enjoy some good food and dancing. So we've done it all. So have a good evening, and thank you for being here.